There are moments when laughter becomes a weapon, when words spoken in jest cut deeper than any blade, when cruelty disguises itself as humor and leaves scars that never fully heal. In a gilded ballroom filled with the wealthy and the powerful, surrounded by crystal and champagne and the hollow laughter of people who had never known hunger, Rashid Al-Zahrani stood before a woman whose only crime was existing in a body the world had taught her to hate. He held up a wedding dress, pristine, white silk that shimmered under chandeliers, and he spoke words that would echo through the following months like thunder before a storm. "If you fit in that dress, I will marry you." The room erupted in laughter, cruel and sharp, as though her pain were entertainment, as though her humanity was something to be gambled with, as though the size of her body determined the worth of her soul. The woman, Layla Mansouri, stood frozen in that moment of public humiliation, her hands trembling, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall, and something inside her shattered and reformed all at once. But what Rashid did not know, what none of them could have imagined as they laughed at her expense, was that his mockery had awakened something far more powerful than shame. He had lit a fire that would consume his arrogance, reveal truths he had spent his life avoiding, and teach him a lesson about dignity that no amount of wealth could buy. What happens next will change everything. Layla Mansouri was not born into suffering, though suffering had found her early and refused to let go. She grew up in a modest home on the outskirts of Riyadh, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a nurse, raised with values that emphasized character over appearance, kindness over cruelty, substance over superficiality. Her childhood was marked by warmth and laughter, by parents who taught her that her worth was inherent and immutable, that her body was a vessel for her spirit and not a measure of her. But the world outside her home did not share these beliefs. From the moment Layla entered school, she learned that society had different rules for girls who looked like her, for bodies that did not conform to the narrow standards of beauty that magazines and movies proclaimed as universal truth. She was bullied relentlessly, called names that still echoed in her nightmares, excluded from friendships and celebrations, treated as though her weight made her less human, less deserving of love and respect and basic dignity. The cruelty followed her through adolescence and into adulthood, shaping her relationship with her own body, teaching her to see herself through the contemptuous eyes of others, rather than through the loving eyes of her parents. But Layla possessed something that cruelty could not touch, a brilliant mind and a generous heart that she poured into her work as a humanitarian doctor. She had studied medicine against all odds, fighting through discrimination and doubt, earning her degree through sheer determination, and spending her career serving refugee camps and disaster zones, where appearance meant nothing and skill meant everything. She had saved lives with hands that society deemed too large, had comforted dying children with arms that magazines would have deemed too soft, had performed surgeries that more conventionally attractive doctors would never attempt, because the conditions were too dangerous and the pay was too little. Layla had learned that real beauty lived in sacrifice and service, in using whatever body you possess to ease the suffering of others, in refusing to let the world's cruelty make you cruel in return. She had made peace with her appearance, or so she believed, had built a life defined by purpose rather than approval, had convinced herself that the opinions of shallow people did not matter. And then she met Rashid Al-Zahrani and discovered that old wounds could still bleed. Rashid was everything. Layla was not, at least on the surface. Born into one of the wealthiest families in the Middle East, heir to a pharmaceutical empire built by his grandfather, educated at Oxford and Harvard, moving through life with the ease of someone who had never been denied anything he desired. He was handsome in that particular way that wealth enhances, his features sharp and aristocratic, his body maintained by personal trainers and private chefs, his wardrobe worth more than most people earned in years. He had been raised to believe that the world existed for his pleasure, That money could purchase anything including people, that his desires were more important than anyone else's dignity. His romantic history was a parade of models and actresses and women whose beauty was their currency, relationships that lasted until he grew bored, or they grew demanding, connections that were transactional rather than transformational. Rashid collected beautiful things, art and cars and women, displaying feminine, like trophies that proved his superiority, his taste, his power. He had never loved anyone, had never allowed himself to be vulnerable enough for love, had confused possession with affection and control with care. At 35, he remained unmarried despite pressure from his family, rejecting every arranged match his mother proposed because none of the women met his impossible standards. The charity gala where their paths crossed was meant to raise funds for medical relief in conflict zones, one of those events where the wealthy gathered to feel virtuous while spending more on a single evening than they donated to the cause. Rashid attended out of obligation, another appearance on his social calendar, another opportunity to be photographed and admired. Layla was there as a speaker, invited to share her experiences working in Syrian refugee camps, to put a human face on the statistics and suffering that these donors funded from a comfortable distance. She stood at the podium in a simple dress that fit her body without apology, and she spoke with a passion and authenticity that silenced the room. She described holding children as they died from preventable diseases, described the shortage of medicine and equipment, described the courage of people who had lost everything but refused to lose their humanity. Her words were powerful and true, and for a moment, the wealthy audience felt something beyond their usual comfortable pity. But when she finished speaking and descended from the stage, the spell broke, and the guests returned to their champagne and their gossip and their judgment. Rashid noticed her immediately, not because of her speech, which he had barely listened to, but because of her body. He was standing with a group of friends, wealthy men who shared his values and his vices, and they began making crude jokes about the speaker, about her weight, about whether she ate all the donations herself, humor that was as old as it was cruel. Someone suggested that Rashid, known for his conquests and his arrogance, should ask her to dance as a joke. The suggestion evolved into a dare, and the dare evolved into something dark. One of his friends produced a wedding dress, an expensive gown that his sister had worn at her recent wedding, size 0, impossibly small, designed for a body that existed more in imagination than reality. The challenge was proposed. Approach the fat doctor. Offer to marry her if she could fit in the dress. Film her. Reaction. Share it with their circle. Prove once again that people like her did not belong in their world. Rashid, drunk on expensive whiskey and even more expensive privilege, agreed. He took the dress and approached Layla with the confidence of someone who had never faced consequences for his cruelty. Layla was standing alone near the windows, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the patients she had left behind to attend this gala, wondering if this evening would generate enough funding to make the absence worthwhile. When Rashid approached with his entourage trailing behind, when he held up the dress with that cruel smile, when he made his proposal loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, Layla felt time slow down. She recognized what was happening immediately. She had experienced variations of this humiliation her entire life. The casual cruelty of people who saw her body as a punchline, who believed that mocking someone's appearance was acceptable. Entertainment. The laughter that followed his words was familiar, the same laughter that had followed her through school hallways and university cafeterias, the laughter of people who felt superior because society had assigned them beauty and denied it to others. For a moment, Layla considered walking away with whatever dignity she could preserve. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was exhaustion from a lifetime of acceptance. Perhaps it was rage at the injustice of existing in a world that valued appearance over character. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that running away had never stopped the cruelty from finding her again. Layla looked directly at Rashid, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that surprised him, and she spoke. Words that cut through the laughter like lightning through darkness. I accept your challenge, but I have a condition of my own. When I fit in that dress, and I will fit in that dress, you will honor your word and marry me. And when you do, you will learn what it means to be judged not by the body you inhabit, but by the soul you possess. And I promise you, the lesson will be more painful than anything you can imagine. The room went silent. Rashid, shocked by her acceptance and her confidence, found himself agreeing before fully processing what he was committing to. His friends laughed nervously, certain that this fat woman could never shrink herself into that tiny dress, that Rashid was safe from his own cruelty. They set a timeline. 6 months, long enough to seem fair, but short enough that transformation seemed impossible. Layla took the dress from Rashid's hands, her fingers steady despite the storm raging inside her, and she left the gala with her head high, carrying both fate, dress, and the weight of a promise that would change both their lives forever. The transformation that followed was not what anyone expected, least of all Layla herself. She did not starve herself, or resort to dangerous measures to reshape her body into something society would approve. Instead, she began a journey inward, examining the beliefs she had internalized about her own worth, confronting the trauma of years of cruelty, learning to separate her value from her appearance in ways that therapy and self-help books had never fully achieved. She hired a personal trainer, not to punish her body but to strengthen it, to celebrate what it could do rather than mourn what it looked like. She worked with a nutritionist to fuel her body properly, to heal the relationship with food that had been damaged by years of judgment and shame. She consulted with a therapist who specialized in trauma, unpacking the pain of public humiliation and private suffering, learning to forgive herself for accepting Rashid's challenge, understanding that her acceptance was not weakness, but a declaration of war against a system that had always told her she was less than. The physical changes came slowly, naturally, as a side effect of treating her body with the respect it had always deserved. But the real transformation was internal. As the months passed, as Layla worked toward fitting in that dress, she discovered something profound. She was not doing this to prove anything to Rashid or his cruel friends, or the society that had rejected her. She was doing this for herself, reclaiming power over her own body and her own narrative, refusing to let cruelty define her anymore. She continued her medical work, traveling to disaster zones and refugee camps, using her body to serve others regardless of how it looked. And in those places where suffering was real and immediate, where children died from lack of medicine and families were torn apart by violence, Layla found perspective. She realized that Rashid's cruelty, while painful, was insignificant compared to the real injustices in the world. She realized that his opinion of her body mattered less than her ability to use that body to save lives. She realized that she had spent too much energy seeking approval from people whose values she did not respect. And she realized that when she finally fit in that dress, when she stood before Rashid and demanded he honor his word, she would not be seeking his acceptance, but delivering his judgment. 6 months arrived faster than anyone anticipated. Rashid had followed Layla's progress through social media and through mutual acquaintances, watching with growing unease as she transformed not just physically but spiritually. The woman he had mocked had disappeared, replaced by someone who radiated confidence and purpose, who posted photos from refugee camps alongside photos from her gym, who seemed to glow with an internal light that had nothing to do with an internal light. Her appearance and everything to do with her character. His friends began making jokes that masked their nervousness, suggesting that Rashid find a way to escape his promise, but pride prevented him from backing down. He convinced himself that even if she fit in the dress, the marriage would be temporary, an annoyance he could endure, and then annul. Another story to tell at parties about the time he married a woman as a joke. He did not understand that he was not the one telling this story anymore. Layla had taken the pen from his hands, and the ending she was writing would teach him lessons he had spent his life avoiding. The day of reckoning arrived with the weight of destiny. Rashid had organized an event, another charity gala at the same venue where the humiliation had occurred, inviting the same guests who had witnessed his cruelty, ensuring maximum audience for what he assumed would be his final mockery. He stood at the center of the ballroom, the wedding dress displayed on a mannequin beside him, waiting for Layla to arrive and fail publicly. His friends surrounded him, their laughter forced, their confidence wavering as the appointed hour approached. When the doors opened and Layla entered, the room fell into absolute silence. She wore a simple black dress that hugged a body transformed not by starvation or surgery, but by strength and self-respect. Her hair was elegantly styled, her makeup subtle, her bearing that of someone who had walked through fire and emerged as steel. But what shocked everyone most was not her appearance, but her presence. She moved through the room like royalty, acknowledging greetings with gracious nods, her eyes fixed on Rashid with an intensity that made him step back. Involuntarily, Layla reached the center of the ballroom and stood before Rashid, and when she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the room. 6 months ago, in this same space, you made me an offer born of cruelty and arrogance. You said that if I fit in this dress, you would marry me. You expected me to fail. You expected that my body, which you judged as unworthy, would remain forever unable to meet your shallow standards. You expected that I would shrink away in shame, accepting once again that people like me do not deserve love or respect or basic human dignity. You were wrong. She took the dress from the mannequin, and with the assistance of 2 attendants who had been waiting discreetly, she changed into it right there in the ballroom, behind a privacy screen but visible enough that everyone could witness the moment. When she emerged wearing the dress, fitting it perfectly, the room erupted not in laughter, but in gasps of shock and something that might have been respect. Rashid stood frozen, his face drained of color, trapped by his own words and his own cruelty. But Layla was not finished. She had not endured 6 months of transformation and a lifetime of humiliation to simply claim a hollow victory. I fit in your dress, Rashid Al-Zahrani T1. Now you will honor your word and marry me. But before you do, this room needs to hear some truths. She turned to address the assembled guests, her voice steady and powerful. 6 months ago, I stood in this room and delivered a speech about suffering in refugee camps, about children dying from preventable diseases, about the desperate need for medical supplies and funding. Do you remember how much was donated that evening? Silence answered her. The total was $800,000. A generous sum, certainly. But do you know how much was spent on this gala itself? On the flowers and the champagne and the entertainment? $1.2 million. You spent more on a single evening of self-congratulation than you donated to save lives. And this is the world that produces men like Rashid, men who believe that cruelty is entertainment, that a woman's body is public property to be judged and mocked, that wealth grants permission to treat others as less than human. She turned back to Rashid, and her eyes held no mercy. You think I transformed myself for you? You think I lost weight to win your approval, to prove that I could meet your standards? You are wrong. I transformed myself despite you. I spent these 6 months learning to love the body you mocked, learning to see strength where you saw weakness, learning to value myself regardless of your opinion or society's judgment. And I learned something else. I learned who you really are, Rashid. I researched your pharmaceutical company, the empire you inherited from your grandfather. Do you want to tell this room how you make your fortune, or shall I? Rashid tried to speak, but no words came. Layla continued, her voice cutting through his. Silence like judgment itself. Your company produces insulin, a life-saving medication for diabetics. Your grandfather developed it with the intention of making it affordable and accessible. But when you took control 5 years ago, you increased the GUF price by 400%. You prioritized profit over people, condemning thousands to choose between buying medicine or feeding their families. Some died because they could not afford the insulin your company produces. Their blood is on your hands, Rashid. You judge me for the size of my body while you profit from disease and suffering. The room erupted into chaos. Some guests defended Rashid, others condemned him, but most simply stood in shocked silence as the perfect facade of wealth and charity crumbled before them. Rashid's friends abandoned him, melting into the crowd to distance themselves from the scandal. His mother, who had attended expecting to mock her son's forced marriage to an unsuitable woman, instead found herself confronting truths about her family's business that she had deliberately ignored. Rashid himself stood paralyzed, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. His cruelty reflected back at him magnified and unavoidable. And Layla, standing in the white dress that had been meant as an instrument of her humiliation, had transformed it into armor, into a symbol of survival and strength and the refusal to be erased. But she was not done. The marriage will proceed as you promised, Rashid. But I will add my own conditions. You will work with me for 1 year in the refugee camps where I serve. You will see the suffering that your greed has caused. You will witness the strength of people who have nothing but refuse to lose their humanity. You will learn what it means to be judged, not for your appearance or your wealth, but for your character and your choices. And at the end of that year, if you still believe that a person's worth is determined by the size of their body or the balance of their bank account, then we will divorce and go our separate ways. But if you learn what I am trying to teach you, if you discover that dignity and respect and love have nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with the soul, then perhaps this marriage that began as mockery can become something real. The choice is yours. But make no mistake, the lesson will be painful, because growth always is. Rashid found his voice finally, and what emerged was not the arrogant cruelty that had defined him, but something raw and broken. Why would you want to marry me after what I did to you? Layla's expression softened slightly, revealing the compassion that had always defined her character beneath the armor she had been forced to build. Because I am not like you, Rashid. I do not believe that cruelty should be answered with more cruelty, that humiliation justifies revenge, that people are beyond redemption. I believe that you are capable of change, that beneath your arrogance and privilege, there might be a human being worth saving. I believe that everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow and become better than they were. But I also believe in accountability. You will face consequences for your actions. You will endure discomfort and challenge and the shattering of your comfortable illusions. And if you survive it, if you allow yourself to be transformed the way you forced me to transform, then perhaps both of us will emerge from this stronger and wiser human than we were before. The wedding took place that very evening, a small civil ceremony attended only by witnesses required by law. There was no romance, no celebration, only a binding of 2 lives that would force both of them into territory neither had imagined. Rashid's family threatened to disown him. His friends mocked him for being trapped by his own cruelty. His business partners questioned his judgment. But he had been raised with a rigid sense of honor, a belief that a man's word, once given, must be kept. And that same honor that had made him agree to Layla's original challenge now forced him to honor his marriage vow. The following week, they departed for a refugee camp on the Syrian border, leaving behind the world of wealth and privilege and comfortable lives, entering a reality where suffering was immediate and mercy was measured in medicine and clean water rather than money and status. The year that followed broke Rashid in ways he had not imagined possible. He, who had never worked a day in his life, found himself hauling water and digging latrines and holding dying children while Layla performed surgeries with inadequate supplies. He witnessed poverty that made his worst nightmares seem comfortable, suffering that his wealth had always insulated him from, resilience in people who had every reason to surrender but refused to stop fighting. He saw Layla work 20-hour days without complaint, saw her comfort grieving mothers with genuine empathy, saw her make impossible decisions about who received limited medicine knowing that others would die as a result. He saw her collapse from exhaustion and rise again the next morning, saw her weep in private and smile for traumatized children, saw her treat every patient, regardless of their appearance or background, with the same dignity and respect. And slowly, painfully, against every instinct his privilege had taught him, Rashid began to change. He learned that strength had nothing to do with physical appearance and everything to do with character. He learned that beauty existed in sacrifice and service rather than symmetry and size. He learned that the body was simply a vessel, and what mattered was how you use that vessel to ease suffering or increase it. He learned that his cruelty had stemmed from insecurity, from a desperate need to feel superior by making others feel inferior, from a terror of being seen as ordinary or flawed. He learned that vulnerability was not weakness but courage, that admitting ignorance was the first step toward wisdom, that asking for forgiveness required more strength than defending pride. And he learned that Layla, the woman he had mocked for her body, possessed more grace and dignity and genuine beauty than anyone he had ever known. He fell in love with her slowly, painfully, knowing that love required him to become someone worthy of her, knowing that she might never return his feelings, knowing that earning her forgiveness would be the hardest work of his life. The transformation was not dramatic or sudden. There was no single moment of revelation, but rather 1,000 small moments that accumulated into change. Rashid, holding a malnourished child, and understanding for the first time that his company's price increases had condemned children like this to suffering. Rashid watching Layla teach a young girl to read, and recognizing that education and empathy were worth more than all his inherited wealth. Rashid, sitting with a poor, dying man who forgave him for being part of the system that had failed to protect refugees. Forgiveness Rashid did not deserve, but desperately needed. Rashid working beside Layla day after day, learning that partnership was not about possession but about mutual respect. That love was not about controlling or changing someone but about supporting them in becoming more fully themselves. And Rashid finally, understanding that the body he had mocked carried a spirit stronger than any he had encountered, that Layla's worth had never been determined by her appearance, but by her choices, that he had been blind his entire life to what actually mattered. Near the end of their contracted year, an outbreak of cholera swept through the camp. Supplies were desperately short, and Layla worked herself to collapse trying to save as many patients as possible. When she fell ill herself, struck down by the disease she had been fighting, Rashid discovered the true measure of his transformation. He who had once cared only for himself now sat beside her through fevered nights, held her hand through the worst of the illness, prayed to a God he had always claimed to believe in but never truly needed. He understood in those dark hours that losing Layla would not just end their marriage but would destroy the person he'd been struggling to become. She had given him purpose beyond profit, meaning beyond status, a chance to be someone worth respecting. If she died, he would lose not just her but himself. When she finally recovered, weak but alive, Rashid broke down completely, weeping with relief and terror and gratitude, and he spoke words he had never imagined saying, "I love you." Not because of how you look or how you have changed, but because of who you are, who you have always been. I love your strength and your compassion and your refusal to let cruelty make you cruel. I love that you saw something worth saving in me when I could not see it myself. I love that you demanded I become better rather than accepting who I was. I do not deserve your love in return. I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn it. But whether you love me or not, thank you for saving my life in every way that matters. Layla looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the arrogant millionaire who had humiliated her, but the broken, transformed man who had spent a year learning what it meant to be human. I do not know if I love you yet, Rashid. Love requires trust, and trust must be earned over time. But I see who you have become, and I respect the courage it took to change. The year we agreed upon has ended. We can divorce now if you wish, return to our separate lives, consider this chapter closed. Or we can continue, not as punishment or obligation, but as partners, building something real from the ruins of what began as cruelty. The choice is yours, but understand that if we continue, you cannot return to who you were. You cannot go back to your comfortable privilege and casual cruelty. You must choose every day to be the man you have struggled to become here. That is the price of my partnership, perhaps eventually my love. Rashid made his choice that day, and it was one that shocked everyone who had known him before. He did not return to his company except to restructure it completely, reducing insulin prices to what his grandfather had originally intended, establishing programs to provide free medicine to those who could not afford it, transforming a profit-driven empire into something that actually served humanity. He used his wealth, not for personal luxury, but to fund medical relief efforts, to build schools in refugee camps, to support the work that Layla had dedicated her life to. He and she and Layla remained married, their relationship evolving from obligation to friendship, to partnership, and finally, slowly, to love. It was not the romantic fairy tale that movies portrayed, but something deeper and more real, a love built on mutual respect and shared values, and the recognition that both of them had been broken by their experiences and rebuilt into something stronger together. Years later, when people asked Layla about her marriage, about how she could forgive Rashid for his initial cruelty, she would tell them the truth. I did not accept his challenge to prove anything to him. I accepted it to prove something to myself, that I would not let cruelty define me, that I could transform not my body, but my relationship with my body. That to take an instrument of humiliation and make it a symbol of strength. What Rashid intended as mockery became the catalyst for both of us to become better than we were. He learned that character matters more than appearance, that privilege is not permission to harm others, that real strength is measured in compassion rather than cruelty. And I learned that standing up for myself, demanding respect, refusing to accept humiliation silently, was not vanity or revenge, but self-preservation. We both learned that transformation is possible when we stop defending who we are and start working toward who we could be. That is not a justification for his cruelty or a redemption that erases harm done. It is simply the truth that people can change when they are forced to confront the consequences of their choices. This story teaches us something fundamental about human dignity and the ways we measure worth. It teaches us that cruelty often stems from insecurity, that there's people who need to diminish others are themselves diminished, that mockery is a shield weak people use to protect themselves from examining their own flaws. It teaches us that appearance is the least interesting thing about a person, that bodies change and age and fail, but character endures, that the time we waste judging others for their weight or their height or their features is time stolen from building anything meaningful. It teaches us that transformation is not about changing yourself to meet someone else's standards, but about becoming more fully yourself, about treating your body with the respect it deserves regardless of how it looks, about recognizing that your worth is inherent and unchangeable despite what society claims. It teaches us that accountability matters, that privilege does not excuse harm, that people in positions of power must be held responsible for how they use that power. It teaches us that redemption is possible, but not guaranteed, that it requires genuine change rather than performative apology, that the person who was harmed gets to decide whether forgiveness is offered. It teaches us that love can grow in unexpected places, that partnerships built on mutual respect and shared values are stronger than relationships based on appearance or status, that the most profound connections often emerge from the most difficult circumstances. The wedding dress that began as an instrument of humiliation now hangs in Layla and Rashid's home, framed and displayed not as a trophy but as a reminder that cruelty can be transformed into strength, that mockery can become motivation, that the weapons used against us can be reclaimed and repurposed. A reminder that judging people by their appearance is not harmless fun but genuine violence, that words carry weight and consequences, that laughter at someone's expense costs them something you cannot see. A reminder that transformation is always possible, but never easy, that growth requires discomfort, that becoming better than you were demands you face who you are, and a reminder that dignity cannot be taken from you, only surrendered, that your worth is not determined by those who judge you, but by how you choose to respond to that judgment. If this story has touched something within you, if you have felt the sting of being judged for your appearance, or recognized your own cruelty reflected in Rashid's mockery, if you understand that we all carry prejudices we must confront and biases we must challenge, then let this moment matter. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that their body is not their worth, that transformation is possible, that standing up for yourself is not vanity but survival. Like this video to ensure these stories reach the people who need them most, who are struggling with their own reflections and their own value in a world that profits from our insecurity. Subscribe to this channel because we will continue telling stories that challenge us to be better, that refuse to accept cruelty as normal, that insist on the dignity of every human being regardless of how they look or where they come from or what they possess. Leave a comment sharing your own experience with a judgment or transformation, because these stories are incomplete until they become conversations, until they inspire us to examine our own choices and change our own behaviors. And remember, as you move through a world that constantly judges and categorizes and diminishes, that every person you encounter is fighting battles you cannot see, carrying pain you cannot measure, possessing strength you cannot imagine. Never let appearance determine how you treat someone. Never use your privilege as permission to harm. Never forget that the cruelty you inflict always costs more than you realize, and that dignity once wounded can take lifetimes to heal. Because every story hides a truth, and every truth deserves to be heard.